What if the man you trusted most betrayed you, and that betrayal cost your father his life? Welcome to another gripping story that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Before we dive deeper, we'd love your support. Please subscribe to our channel, give this video a like, and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next thrilling tale. Your support means everything and helps us create even more amazing content. 20 years later, his son, a young FBI agent, fights to uncover the truth. But some secrets refuse to stay buried. Now, a corrupt police chief and a web of lies threaten to destroy everything he's worked for. Will he bring justice to his father's name, or fall victim to the same fate? From betrayal to redemption, secrets unravel in this explosive tale of justice, corruption, and family. Stay with us to uncover the shocking truth behind a betrayal that changed everything. In a world where loyalty is shattered and justice is fragile, one question remains: how far would you go to uncover the truth? Don't miss the twists and turns of this unforgettable story. The industrial district of Brookhaven was a ghost town at night, a desolate labyrinth of abandoned warehouses, cracked concrete, and the faint echoes of a city that had long since forgotten its industrial roots. Officer David Carter stepped lightly, his boots crunching against shards of broken glass as he approached the heart of the district. The moon hung low, casting an eerie silver glow over the scene. His hand hovered near the grip of his service weapon, and the static-filled murmurs from his radio were the only sounds that accompanied him. It was supposed to be a routine operation, a tip from an informant about an arms deal going down in one of the warehouses. But routine hadn't felt right for David in a long time, and tonight was no exception. The air was too still, the silence too thick, as if the night itself was holding its breath. David stopped behind a stack of rusted metal crates, peering into the shadows ahead. The warehouse loomed before him, its broken windows glinting like jagged teeth in the moonlight. He could see movement inside, figures unloading crates from the back of a truck. Even from this distance, the faint glint of metal inside the crates was unmistakable: military-grade firearms, the kind that could arm an army or spark a war. David's heart quickened, but he steadied his breathing. He needed to wait for backup. His radio crackled, and he pressed it to his lips. "Sullivan, you in position?" he whispered. There was no immediate response, just the faint hum of static. "Frank, come in," David said again, his voice firmer. This time, the response came, but it wasn't what he expected. "I'm here, Dave," Frank Sullivan's voice crackled through the radio, but there was an edge to it that made David's stomach churn. Something was wrong. "Where's your position?" David asked, scanning the shadows for any sign of his partner. "Right behind you," Frank said, his voice cold and flat. David froze, his breath catching in his throat. Slowly, he turned, and there was Frank, standing a few feet away, his gun drawn and pointed directly at David. "Frank, what the hell are you doing?" David demanded, his hand instinctively moving toward his own weapon. "Don't," Frank warned, his tone sharp. "Just don't." The betrayal hit like a punch to the gut. Frank Sullivan, his partner of nearly a decade, the man he'd trusted with his life countless times, now stood on the wrong side of the law. "You don't have to do this," David said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. "Think about what you're doing." Frank's jaw tightened, and for a moment, David thought he saw a flicker of regret in his partner's eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "You should have walked away, Dave," Frank said quietly. "But you didn't, and now you've seen too much." Before David could react, a sharp whistle caught through the air, and two men stepped out of the shadows behind Frank, their faces obscured by ski masks. One of them carried a crate similar to the ones being unloaded from the truck, while the other held a gun trained on David. "This is your chance to leave, Frank," David said, his voice firm. "You don't have to go through with this." Frank didn't respond. Instead, he stepped aside, giving the masked men a clear line of sight to David. The man with the gun raised it, and David's instincts kicked in. He lunged for cover behind the metal crates as the first shot rang out, the deafening crack echoing through the empty district. The next few moments were a blur of chaos. David returned fire, his training taking over as he assessed the situation. But he was outnumbered, and the masked men moved with military precision, cutting off his escape routes. David's mind raced as he realized there was no way out. His thoughts turned to his family, his wife, his 10-year-old son Ethan. He couldn't leave them like this. He couldn't let them remember him as a failure. A sharp pain shot through his side as a bullet grazed him, and he staggered, his vision blurring. He fell to his knees, clutching his side as blood seeped through his fingers. The masked men closed in, their guns trained on him. Frank stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry, Dave," he said quietly, and for a moment, David thought he saw a glimmer of the man he used to know. But then Frank turned away, and one of the masked men raised his gun. The last thing David saw was the barrel of the weapon, the cold steel glinting in the moonlight, before the final shot rang out. Miles away, Ethan Carter sat in the back seat of his mother's car, swinging his legs idly as they drove toward the precinct. He was excited to see his father, having convinced his mom to let him stay up late to surprise him. But as they turned onto 12th Street, the flashing red and blue lights of police cruisers illuminated the night, casting an ominous glow over the scene. Ethan's excitement turned to confusion, then dread, as they approached the cordoned-off area. His mother parked the car and stepped out, her movements frantic as she pushed through the crowd of officers. "Stay here, Ethan," she said, her voice trembling, but Ethan didn't listen. He slipped out of the car, his small frame unnoticed in the chaos, and wove through the legs of towering officers. He stopped when he saw it, his father's lifeless body lying on the cold pavement, his badge glinting faintly under the harsh glare of the streetlights. "Dad?" Ethan's voice was small, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of a world shattered. A hand grasped his shoulder, pulling him back, but Ethan barely registered it. His world had shrunk to the sight of his father, motionless and still. He didn't feel the tears streaming down his face, didn't hear his mother's anguished cries. All he felt was the weight of that moment, a weight that would follow him for the rest of his life. Ethan Carter woke with a start, the sharp edges of his father's murder cutting through the veil of sleep as if it had happened only yesterday. The nightmare was always the same, the sound of gunfire, the glint of a badge smeared with blood, and the crushing weight of helplessness as he watched his father fall over and over again. Sitting upright in bed, Ethan wiped the sweat from his brow, his breaths shallow and rapid. Beside him, Rachel stirred, her hand brushing against his arm. "Another one?" she asked softly, her voice heavy with sleep but laced with concern. Ethan nodded, unable to find the words. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, the cool hardwood floor grounding him as he tried to shake off the lingering ghosts of the past. Rachel sat up, watching him with worried eyes. "Ethan," she began, but he cut her off with a gentle shake of his head. "I just need some air," he said, standing and grabbing a hoodie from the chair in the corner of the room. He stepped out into the kitchen, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the quiet apartment. Pouring himself a glass of water, Ethan stared out the window at the city below. Brookhaven was deceptively calm at this hour, its chaos muted by distance and darkness. But Ethan knew better. Beneath the surface, the city was a tangled web of crime and corruption, the kind his father had fought to expose and that now, 2 decades later, Ethan had dedicated his life to unraveling. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the FBI field office, a sleek, modern building that stood in stark contrast to the gritty streets of his childhood. The lobby buzzed with activity, agents rushing between meetings, phones ringing incessantly, and the faint aroma of burnt coffee lingering in the air. As Ethan stepped onto the operations floor, His partner, Emily Hayes, greeted him with a steaming cup of coffee and a file thick with papers. "You look like hell," she said, though her tone was more matter-of-fact than teasing. "Rough night?" "Something like that," Ethan replied, taking the coffee with a nod of thanks. Emily was sharp and efficient, her no-nonsense demeanor a perfect counterbalance to Ethan's quiet intensity. Together, they had cracked some of the toughest cases the Bureau had faced in recent years, but this one felt different, more personal. "What do we have?" Ethan asked, flipping open the file as they walked toward their shared desk. Emily pointed to a map dotted with red pins. "Trafficking case. Military-grade weapons being funneled through the city, likely ending up in the hands of organized crime syndicates. We've been tracking their movements for weeks, but something doesn't add up. Their routes are too clean, too precise. Whoever's running this knows how to cover their tracks." Ethan scanned the documents, his brow furrowing as he focused on one location, the 22nd precinct. His heart skipped a beat. It was his father's old precinct, the place where David Carter had worked tirelessly to root out corruption and where Ethan had spent countless afternoons as a child, waiting for his dad to finish his shift. "The 22nd, Ethan murmured, his voice tight. Emily glanced at him, her expression curious but careful. "Yeah. It's flagged in multiple reports. Seems like a lot of evidence disappears when it gets routed through there." Ethan's mind raced, the knot in his chest tightening. "And who's running the precinct now?" "Chief Frank Sullivan," Emily replied, flipping through her notes. "You know him?" Ethan's jaw clenched as memories of his father's old partner flooded back. Frank Sullivan had been like an uncle to him growing up, a trusted figure who had always seemed larger than life. But now, the thought of Sullivan being tied to the very corruption his father had fought against made Ethan's stomach churn. "Yeah," Ethan said finally. "I know him." Emily studied him for a moment but didn't press. "You think there's a connection?" Ethan hesitated. "I don't know. But we need to find out." The weight of his father's legacy bore down on him as he delved deeper into the case, each piece of evidence pulling him closer to a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to face. The cold fluorescent lights of the FBI archives cast long shadows over the rows of filing cabinets, their metallic surfaces gleaming like sentinels guarding the secrets within. Ethan moved methodically down the aisle, pulling files from drawers that creaked with age, the musty scent of paper and ink filling the air. Emily worked a few feet away, her sharp eyes scanning reports with practiced efficiency. They were chasing a lead, a faint trail left behind by years of negligence and cover-ups, but every step forward felt like trudging through quicksand. "Got something," Emily called, holding up a folder. Ethan stepped over, and she handed him the file. It was a case report from the 22nd Precinct, dated 1994, the year his father was killed. The report detailed a series of arms shipments intercepted in the city, but the language was vague, and key details were conspicuously absent. "Look at this," Emily said, pointing to a list of evidence items logged from one of the raids. A notebook was recorded as part of the evidence, but it's not in the archives. Ethan's stomach sank as he stared at the page. His father had always kept meticulous notes, scribbling details of his cases in a battered leather notebook that Ethan remembered seeing on his father's desk countless times. "They buried it," Ethan said, his voice tight with anger. "Whoever took this case over made sure the trail went cold." Emily nodded, her expression grim. "And look at this name," she added, pointing to the bottom of the report. "Detective Frank Sullivan. He was the lead investigator." Ethan's hands clenched into fists. Sullivan's name had appeared too many times now to be a coincidence. The man who had been his father's partner, his confidant, was emerging as a central figure in the very corruption his father had died fighting against. But Ethan wasn't just chasing Sullivan, he was chasing answers, closure, and the truth that had eluded him for 20 years. "We need to dig deeper," Ethan said, his resolve hardening. Emily nodded. "Let's cross-reference this with the precinct's financial records. If Sullivan's dirty, there's got to be a money trail." The hours stretched into the night as they pored over reports, piecing together fragments of a puzzle that seemed almost intentionally scattered. Patterns began to emerge, evidence disappearing, cases closed prematurely, officers transferred suddenly or retiring under mysterious circumstances. And at the center of it all was Frank Sullivan. "He's been doing this for years," Emily said, her tone equal parts awe and disgust. "Using his position to shield himself while running the whole operation." Ethan's jaw tightened. Not anymore. The next step in their investigation led Ethan and Emily to the outskirts of Brookhaven, where an old informant had tipped them off about a former detective from the 22nd Precinct who might have information on Sullivan's operation. Jack Devlin had left the force years ago, his name disappearing from the records almost as quickly as his career. But his connection to Sullivan, and to the network they were unraveling, was undeniable. Tracking Devlin to a rundown motel on the edge of town, Ethan and Emily approached cautiously, their weapons drawn as they moved down the dimly lit hallway. The motel smelled of mildew and desperation, its peeling wallpaper and flickering lights adding to the sense of decay. Room 107 was their target. Ethan knocked, his knuckles rapping sharply against the wood. "Jack Devlin," he called. "FBI. Open the door." For a moment, there was silence, and Ethan thought they might have been too late. But then the door creaked open, revealing a gaunt man with sunken eyes and a face that had aged far beyond his years. "What do you want?" Devlin asked, his voice hoarse and weary. "We need to talk about Frank Sullivan," Ethan said, stepping into the room. Devlin stiffened at the name, his hand tightening on the doorknob. "I don't know anything," he said quickly, but his eyes betrayed him. "Don't lie to me," Ethan said, his voice sharp. "We know you worked with Sullivan. We know you helped him cover up my father's murder. Now, you can either help us bring him down, or we'll make sure you go down with him." Devlin's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him as he stepped aside to let them in. The room was sparse, a single bed and a table cluttered with cigarette butts and empty beer cans. Devlin sat heavily on the edge of the bed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "You don't understand what you're asking," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sullivan, he's not just a dirty cop. He's got people in his pocket, powerful people. If I talk, I'm dead. If you don't talk, you're already dead," Ethan shot back. "Sullivan's cleaning house. How long do you think you've got before he comes for you?" Devlin hesitated, his eyes darting to the door as if expecting Sullivan to burst in at any moment. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders sagging in defeat. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," he said. "Back then, we were just trying to make a little extra money. But Sullivan, he got greedy. He started dealing with people you don't cross, and when your dad started poking around, he became a problem." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, his heart pounding in his chest. "What happened the night my father died?" Devlin looked away, his face pale. "Sullivan set him up. He knew your dad wouldn't stop digging, so he gave the traffickers the green light. They took care of the rest." The room fell silent, the weight of Devlin's confession pressing down on Ethan like a physical force. He had always suspected Sullivan's involvement, but hearing it confirmed was like reopening an old wound. "You're going to help us bring him down," Ethan said finally, his voice cold and steady. Devlin nodded, his eyes hollow. "If I don't, he'll kill me anyway." Jack Devlin sat hunched over the table in the safe house, his fingers twitching as he lit another cigarette. The room was stark and functional, its walls bare except for a single window with blinds drawn tight. Ethan and Emily watched him carefully, their presence a silent reminder that he was walking a razor-thin line. Devlin had agreed to cooperate, but his fear was palpable, every glance over his shoulder a testament to the shadow Frank Sullivan cast over him. "I told you everything I know," Devlin muttered, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "Sullivan's been running this operation for years. Weapons, drugs, even people, he's got his fingers in all of it. And he's got protection, the kind of people who make you disappear if you even think about crossing them." Ethan's jaw tightened, his patience thinning. "We need specifics. Names, locations, anything we can use to build a case." Devlin hesitated, his gaze darting between them. "There's a warehouse on the east side. That's where he moves most of the shipments. It's heavily guarded, no one gets in or out without his say-so." Emily scribbled the address into her notebook, her expression grim. "What about his connections? Who's protecting him?" Devlin shook his head. "I don't know their names. But they're powerful, politicians, businessmen, even other cops. Sullivan's smart, he never lets anyone see the full picture." Ethan leaned forward, his voice low and firm. "If you're lying to us, Devlin, I'll personally make sure you rot in a cell for the rest of your life." Devlin flinched, but there was a flicker of defiance in his eyes. "You think I want to be here? I didn't sign up for this. Sullivan dragged me into it, and now I'm stuck. But if you think you can take him down, you're dreaming. He's untouchable." Ethan stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "We'll see about that." Emily followed him out into the hallway, closing the door behind them. "He's scared out of his mind," she said quietly. "And he has every reason to be." Ethan nodded, his expression hard. "Which means we need to move fast. If Sullivan gets wind of this, Devlin's as good as dead, and we might be too." The night was cold and damp as Ethan and Emily crouched behind a row of rusted shipping containers, the faint hum of activity from the warehouse ahead breaking the otherwise eerie silence. The address Devlin had given them led here, a sprawling industrial complex on the outskirts of the city. It was the perfect place to hide illicit shipments, isolated, unassuming, and easy to secure. Ethan adjusted the earpiece in his ear, his voice low as he spoke into the comms. "Team Alpha, status?" A crackle of static preceded the reply. "In position," a voice confirmed. "Ready when you are." Emily glanced at Ethan, her eyes sharp with focus. "You think he's telling the truth?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "We're about to find out." They moved silently toward the warehouse, their weapons drawn. The air smelled of oil and rust, the ground slick with rain that had fallen earlier in the evening. Ethan's pulse quickened as they approached the side entrance, a heavy steel door partially ajar. He motioned for Emily to cover him as he pushed it open, the faint creak of hinges making him wince. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit, rows of wooden crates stacked high against the walls. The faint sound of voices echoed from deeper within, accompanied by the metallic clang of machinery. Ethan signaled for the team to move in, their footsteps muffled by the concrete floor. They split into pairs, fanning out to secure the perimeter. Emily gestured to one of the crates, her flashlight revealing the markings of a weapons manufacturer. "Bingo," she whispered. Ethan nodded, his grip tightening on his weapon as they moved closer to the source of the voices. Around a corner, they found a group of men loading crates onto a truck, their movements efficient and deliberate. Sullivan wasn't among them, but Ethan recognized one of the men from a surveillance photo, a known associate of the arms network. "On my signal," Ethan murmured into his comms. "We take them down quietly." The team moved into position, but just as Ethan raised his hand to give the signal, a gunshot rang out. Chaos erupted as the warehouse filled with the deafening sounds of gunfire and shouts. Ethan dove behind a stack of crates, returning fire as the smugglers scattered. Emily was beside him, her movements precise as she neutralized one of the gunmen. "So much for quiet," she muttered. Just stay on them, Ethan replied, his focus razor-sharp. The firefight lasted several tense minutes, but the smugglers were no match for the FBI team. One by one, they were subdued, their weapons clattering to the floor. Ethan cuffed the last of them, his chest heaving as the adrenaline coursed through his veins. But as he surveyed the scene, his triumph was short-lived. One of the crates had been opened in the chaos, revealing not just weapons but documents, shipping manifests, transaction records, and names. Ethan's heart sank as he read through them. Sullivan's name was there, alongside several others he recognized, names of politicians, business leaders, and officers from the 22nd Precinct. "This is bigger than we thought," Emily said, her voice tight. "Sullivan's just the tip of the iceberg." Ethan nodded grimly. "And we just painted a target on our backs." The drive back to the FBI field office was tense, the weight of what they'd uncovered hanging heavy in the air. Ethan gripped the wheel tightly, his thoughts racing. The raid had been a success, but it had also confirmed what he'd feared all along: Sullivan's corruption ran deeper than he could have imagined. "We need to secure those documents," Emily said, breaking the silence. "If Sullivan or anyone in his network finds out we have them..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Ethan nodded, his jaw set. "First thing tomorrow, we take this to the director. We need more resources, this isn't something we can handle alone." But even as he said the words, a nagging doubt crept into his mind. Sullivan's reach extended farther than they had anticipated. Could they even trust the Bureau to act decisively? The thought unsettled him, but he pushed it aside. They had no choice but to move forward. The following morning, Ethan and Emily met with Director Harper in a secure conference room, the recovered documents spread out across the table. Harper was a seasoned agent, his graying hair and stern demeanor a testament to years of navigating the murky waters of law enforcement. He studied the evidence carefully, his expression growing darker with each passing moment. "This is damning," he said finally, his voice low. "If this gets out, it could shake the entire foundation of the Bureau." "Then we can't let it sit," Ethan said firmly. "We need to move on Sullivan now, before he has a chance to cover his tracks." Harper nodded slowly. "Agreed. But this isn't just about Sullivan. If these names are legitimate, we're looking at a nationwide network of corruption. This will require coordination at the highest levels." Emily glanced at Ethan, her expression cautious. "That's going to take time. And Sullivan's not going to wait around for us to build a case." Harper's gaze sharpened. "Then you two need to keep him occupied. Apply pressure, make him sweat. But don't tip your hand, we can't afford to lose the element of surprise." As they left the meeting, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking a tightrope. Every step brought them closer to the truth, but it also increased the risk of a fatal misstep. And with Sullivan undoubtedly aware of their movements, the danger was only growing. Ethan's apartment felt colder than usual that night, the shadows in the corners stretching longer than they should have. He sat at his kitchen table, the documents from the raid spread out before him. Each name, each transaction, was another thread in the tangled web Sullivan had spun. But it wasn't just about Sullivan anymore. This was bigger than one man, bigger than Brookhaven. A sudden knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. Ethan grabbed his weapon, his instincts on high alert. "Who is it?" he called. "It's me," came Emily's voice from the other side. Ethan relaxed slightly, unlocking the door and letting her in. She looked as tense as he felt, her eyes scanning the room before she spoke. "We've got a problem," she said, handing him her phone. Ethan frowned as he read the message on the screen. "You're digging too deep. Back off, or you'll end up like your father." His blood ran cold. "When did you get this?" "An hour ago," Emily replied. "It came from an untraceable number." Ethan's mind raced. The threat was clear, but the fact that they had targeted Emily as well meant that Sullivan, or whoever was pulling the strings, was feeling the pressure. "This means we're close," Ethan said, his voice hard. "And it means they're scared." "It also means they're desperate," Emily countered. "We need to be careful. If they're willing to send threats, they're willing to act on them." Ethan nodded, his resolve hardening. "Then we hit them first. No more waiting." Ethan Carter sat in the dimly lit conference room at the FBI field office, the glow from the overhead projector illuminating the faces of his team. The air was thick with tension, the weight of their discoveries pressing down on everyone present. The documents recovered from the warehouse had laid bare a sprawling network of corruption and criminal activity, but it was the names that had sent shockwaves through the Bureau. High-ranking officials, prominent business leaders, and even politicians were implicated, their connections to Frank Sullivan's operation undeniable. Emily Hayes stood at the head of the table, her voice steady as she outlined their next steps. "We've established that Sullivan isn't just a participant in this network, he's a linchpin. His position as chief of the 22nd Precinct gives him the authority and resources to move shipments without suspicion. But he's also careful, using intermediaries to distance himself from the transactions." Ethan nodded, his jaw tight. "And those intermediaries are our way in. If we can flip one of them, we can start dismantling the operation from the inside." The plan was ambitious, but they had no choice. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that Sullivan's reach extended far beyond Brookhaven. This wasn't just about bringing down a corrupt cop, it was about exposing a system that had been operating in the shadows for decades. As the meeting concluded, Ethan and Emily lingered in the room, their focus shifting to the immediate challenge before them, protecting their key witness, Jack Devlin. "He's a loose end," Emily said, her tone laced with concern. "If Sullivan gets to him, we lose everything." Ethan leaned against the table, his arms crossed. "Then we keep him safe. But we need to move fast. If we wait too long, Sullivan will have time to cover his tracks." The decision was made. They would bring Devlin in for questioning under tight security, using his testimony to build a case strong enough to withstand the inevitable backlash. But as they prepared to leave, Ethan's phone buzzed with an incoming message. The text was brief but chilling. "You're running out of time, Carter. Back off, or you'll regret it." The safe house where Jack Devlin was being held was a nondescript building on the outskirts of the city, its unremarkable exterior designed to blend seamlessly into the surrounding neighborhood. Inside, however, it was a fortress, equipped with state-of-the-art surveillance and a team of agents dedicated to ensuring Devlin's safety. But as Ethan and Emily arrived, a sense of unease settled over them. Something about the quiet felt off, too perfect in its stillness. Ethan's hand instinctively moved to his weapon as they entered the building, his eyes scanning every corner for signs of trouble. Devlin sat at the kitchen table, his gaunt frame hunched over a cup of coffee. He looked up as they entered, his expression a mix of relief and anxiety. "About time you got here," he muttered. "I've been feeling like a sitting duck." Emily crossed her arms, her gaze sharp. "You're safe here. But we need to talk about the names on those documents. Who else is involved?" Devlin hesitated, his hands trembling as he set the coffee cup down. "There's one name you won't find on those papers," he said quietly. "But he's the one pulling the strings. A guy named Victor Langston. He's the money behind Sullivan's operation, the guy who makes it all work." Ethan frowned. The name was unfamiliar, but the implications were clear. Langston wasn't just another player, he was a puppet master, orchestrating the network from behind the scenes. "Where can we find him?" Ethan asked. Devlin shook his head. "I don't know. The guy's a ghost. But if you want to get to him, you'll need Sullivan. He's the only one who knows how to reach Langston." the revelation added a new layer of complexity to their investigation. Taking down Sullivan was no longer just about justice, it was about cutting off the head of the snake. But as they strategized their next move, the safe house's alarm system suddenly blared to life. "We've got company," one of the agents shouted, his weapon drawn. Ethan and Emily moved quickly, taking up defensive positions as the sound of tires screeching outside grew louder. The attack was swift and coordinated, masked men breaching the perimeter with military precision. Gunfire erupted, the sharp cracks echoing through the building as the agents fought to hold their ground. Ethan stayed close to Devlin, shielding him from the chaos as Emily covered their escape route. "We need to move," she shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. Ethan nodded, leading Devlin toward the back exit as bullets whizzed past them. The attackers were relentless, their intent clear: eliminate Devlin and anyone who stood in their way. But Ethan wasn't about to let that happen. The safe house was in shambles, its once secure walls riddled with bullet holes and shattered glass. Ethan and Emily emerged into the night, their breaths ragged as they guided Devlin toward a waiting vehicle. The attackers were still close, their shouts and footsteps echoing in the distance. "Get in!" Ethan barked, opening the door and shoving Devlin into the back seat. Emily jumped into the passenger seat as Ethan slid behind the wheel, his foot slamming down on the gas. The car roared to life, tearing down the narrow street as the first of the attackers appeared behind them. The chase was harrowing, the attackers' vehicles closing in as they weaved through the city's backstreets. Ethan's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his focus unwavering as he navigated the treacherous terrain. "They're gaining on us!" Emily shouted, her weapon at the ready. Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror, his jaw tightening. "Hold on!" He veered sharply, the tires screeching as the car narrowly avoided a collision with a dumpster. Emily leaned out the window, firing at the pursuers and hitting the lead car's tire. It skidded out of control, crashing into a lamppost and blocking the others momentarily. "Nice shot," Ethan muttered, his eyes locked on the road ahead. But the reprieve was short-lived. Another car appeared in their path, cutting them off and forcing Ethan to swerve into an alleyway. The walls were narrow, the space barely wide enough for their vehicle, but Ethan pushed forward, determined to stay ahead. The attackers fired indiscriminately, the bullets ricocheting off the brick walls. "We can't keep this up," Emily said, reloading her weapon. Ethan's mind raced as he considered their options. They needed to lose their pursuers, but the city offered few places to hide. Then he remembered the industrial district, a maze of warehouses and abandoned buildings that could provide the cover they needed. "Hang on," he said, turning sharply toward the district. The car skidded onto the gravel road, kicking up dust as they sped toward the labyrinth of structures. The attackers followed, their headlights cutting through the darkness. But Ethan knew these streets better than they did, and he used the terrain to his advantage, weaving through narrow alleys and blind corners until their pursuers were left behind. Finally, they came to a stop in an abandoned lot, the car's engine ticking as it cooled. Ethan turned to Emily, his breath heavy. "Is everyone okay?" Emily nodded, checking her weapon. "For now. But we can't stay here long." In the back seat, Devlin was visibly shaken, his hands trembling as he wiped the sweat from his brow. "I told you they'd come for me," he muttered. "Sullivan doesn't leave loose ends." Ethan leaned back, his mind racing. The attack had only confirmed what they already knew: Sullivan was desperate, and the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous he became. Back at the field office, the aftermath of the attack weighed heavily on everyone. Devlin was placed under even tighter security, but the incident had rattled him, and Ethan knew they were running out of time. Sullivan's network was vast, but their resources were not, and the longer they waited, the more opportunities they gave him to strike back. Emily paced the conference room, her frustration evident. "We can't keep reacting to him," she said. "We need to take the fight to him." Ethan nodded, his expression grim. "Agreed. But we need more leverage. Devlin's testimony isn't enough. We need to catch Sullivan in the act." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Director Harper entered, his face lined with concern. "We've got a lead," he said, setting a file on the table. "One of our informants just tipped us off about a meeting between Sullivan and one of his suppliers. It's happening tonight." Ethan's pulse quickened. This was the opportunity they had been waiting for. "Where?" Harper pointed to a location on the map, a secluded marina on the edge of the city. "It's a private dock. Minimal security, but Sullivan's likely to have backup." Emily leaned over the map, her brow furrowing. "If we can intercept the meeting, we can catch him red-handed. But we need to be smart about this. One wrong move, and he'll slip through our fingers." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then we don't make any wrong moves." The night air was heavy with the salty tang of the ocean as Ethan and Emily crouched behind a stack of crates near the edge of the marina. The private dock Sullivan had chosen for his meeting was eerily quiet, the soft lapping of waves against the pilings the only sound. A single streetlight flickered above the entrance, casting long, wavering shadows over the scene. Through his binoculars, Ethan watched as a sleek black car pulled up to the dock, its headlights slicing through the darkness. Sullivan stepped out, his posture relaxed but his movements deliberate. Even from a distance, Ethan could see the cold calculation in his former mentor's every move. Moments later, a second vehicle arrived, a van with tinted windows. Two men emerged, their silhouettes imposing against the faint glow of the streetlight. One carried a briefcase, the other a weapon slung casually over his shoulder. "That's our guy," Emily whispered, nudging Ethan and nodding toward the man with the briefcase. "We've got confirmation from the informant, he's a supplier for the network." Ethan nodded, his mind racing through the plan. They couldn't afford to act prematurely, they needed solid evidence to tie Sullivan directly to the operation. As the men began unloading crates from the van, Ethan activated his comms. "Team Alpha, are you in position?" A crackle of static preceded the response. "Affirmative. Standing by." The plan was simple but risky: wait until the transaction was underway, then move in and secure both Sullivan and his supplier. But as Ethan and Emily crept closer, the faint hum of an approaching boat caught their attention. A sleek speedboat glided into view, its engine barely audible as it docked alongside the marina. A third man stepped out, his presence commanding. He was tall, with sharp features and an air of authority that made Ethan's stomach churn. "Victor Langston," Emily murmured, her voice laced with tension. Ethan's grip tightened on his weapon. Langston's sudden appearance changed everything. The man was a ghost, a shadowy figure whose name had surfaced only recently in their investigation. If they could capture him alongside Sullivan, it would be a game-changer. But it also meant the stakes were higher than ever. As Langston joined the group, Ethan activated his comms again. "Change of plans. Langston is here. We move on my signal." The minutes that followed felt like hours, the tension mounting as the men on the dock conducted their business. Langston inspected the crates, nodding in approval as Sullivan handed him a sealed envelope. The supplier opened the briefcase, revealing stacks of cash that glinted under the dim light. "Now," Ethan whispered, his voice sharp. The team moved with precision, storming the dock with weapons drawn. "FBI! Hands in the air!" Ethan's voice cut through the night like a whip, startling the men out of their calm. For a moment, chaos erupted. Sullivan reached for his weapon but froze as Emily's aim zeroed in on him. Langston's men attempted to flee, but the agents were faster, intercepting them before they could reach the speedboat. Langston himself remained eerily calm, his hands raised as he surveyed the scene with cold detachment. "Well," he said, his voice smooth. "This is unexpected." Ethan stepped forward, his gun trained on Sullivan. "It's over, Frank. You're done." Sullivan's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing. "You don't know what you're doing, Carter. This is bigger than me, bigger than anything you can imagine." "Save it for the courtroom," Ethan shot back, motioning for an agent to cuff him. As Sullivan was led away, Ethan turned his attention to Langston, who was watching him with an unsettling smirk. "You've just opened Pandora's box, Agent Carter," Langston said as the cuffs were snapped onto his wrists. "I hope you're ready for what comes next." The interrogation room was stark and cold, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows over the faces of Ethan and Langston. The man who had orchestrated one of the most complex criminal networks Ethan had ever encountered sat across from him, his posture relaxed despite the circumstances. Langston's confidence was unnerving, a silent reminder that even in custody, he believed himself untouchable. "You think you've won," Langston said, his voice calm and measured. "But you've only scratched the surface. There are others, more powerful than you can imagine, who won't let this stand." Ethan leaned forward, his expression hard. "Let me guess. Sullivan was just a pawn, and you're just a middleman." "Save the theatrics, Langston. We've got enough on you to put you away for life." Langston chuckled, shaking his head. "You really don't get it, do you? This isn't about me. It's about the system. You can take me down, but the machine keeps turning." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he refused to let Langston rattle him. "We'll see about that." As the interrogation continued, Emily watched from the observation room, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. Director Harper stood beside her, his gaze fixed on Langston. "He's right, you know," Harper said quietly. "This isn't the end. It's just the beginning." Emily glanced at him, her eyes narrowing. "Then we better make sure our beginning hits hard enough to make a dent." The evidence collected at the marina was damning, implicating not only Sullivan and Langston but also several high-ranking officials whose names had appeared in the recovered documents. The Bureau moved swiftly, coordinating raids and arrests across the city. The media frenzy that followed was unprecedented, the headlines plastered with the faces of those who had once been untouchable. But even as the operation gained momentum, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. Langston's words haunted him, a nagging reminder that the network was far more intricate than they had anticipated. His suspicions were confirmed when Emily burst into his office late one night, her face pale and her hands clutching a file. "We've got a problem," she said, her voice trembling. "There's a leak." Ethan's heart sank as he read through the documents she handed him. Sensitive information about their investigation had been passed to someone outside the Bureau, compromising their operations and putting their lives at risk. "Who?" Ethan asked, his voice sharp. Emily hesitated, her eyes filled with doubt. "We don't know. But whoever it is, they're close." The realization that there was a mole within their ranks sent ripples of paranoia through the team. Trust was strained, every interaction laced with suspicion as Ethan and Emily worked tirelessly to identify the traitor. The task was daunting, the list of potential suspects long and their resources stretched thin. But as the days passed, patterns began to emerge, and their focus narrowed. One name stood out among the rest, a senior agent with access to classified information and a history of unexplained absences. Agent Samuel Drake. Confronting Drake was a delicate matter. If he truly was the mole, tipping him off could jeopardize the entire operation. But if he wasn't, the accusation could destroy his career and their already fragile team dynamic. "We need proof," Emily said as they reviewed Drake's records. "Something concrete that ties him to the leak." Ethan nodded, his jaw set. "Then we watch him." Every move, every conversation. If he's dirty, he'll slip up. The surveillance was grueling, the hours long and the tension high as they tracked Drake's movements. He was careful, his actions seemingly above reproach. But late one night, Ethan and Emily caught a break. Drake met with an unknown contact in a secluded cafe, their conversation brief but telling. Hidden microphones captured fragments of their exchange, enough to confirm his involvement in the leak. "He's our guy," Emily said, her voice heavy with a mix of relief and frustration. "But why? What's his angle?" The answer came in the form of a bank statement recovered from Drake's records, an offshore account with deposits far exceeding his salary. The money trail led back to Langston, proving that Drake had been on the payroll all along. Confronting Drake was a calculated risk, but it was one Ethan was willing to take. The meeting took place in an empty conference room, the tension palpable as Ethan laid out the evidence. Drake's initial denial quickly gave way to anger, his composure cracking under the weight of the accusations. "You don't understand," he snapped. "Langston owns everything. I didn't have a choice." Ethan's voice was cold. "You had a choice. And you chose to betray everything this badge stands for." The arrest of Agent Samuel Drake sent shockwaves through the Bureau, but it also provided the break they needed. Under interrogation, Drake revealed critical details about Langston's operation, including the location of a secure facility where the network's records were stored. The facility, a heavily fortified compound on the outskirts of the city, was their last chance to bring the entire operation down. The raid was planned with military precision, every detail meticulously accounted for. Ethan and Emily led the team, their resolve unshaken despite the dangers ahead. As they approached the compound under the cover of darkness, the tension was electric, each agent acutely aware of the risks. The initial breach was swift, the team moving through the compound with practiced efficiency. But as they reached the central office, the resistance intensified. Langston's men were well-trained and heavily armed, their desperation making them all the more dangerous. Ethan fought his way through the chaos, his focus laser-sharp as he secured the records room. Inside, stacks of files and hard drives awaited, each one a treasure trove of evidence. But as he worked to secure the data, Langston appeared, his presence commanding even amid the chaos. "You think this ends here?" Langston sneered, his gun trained on Ethan. "You're a fool, Carter. This is bigger than you, bigger than anything you can comprehend." Ethan didn't flinch. "Maybe. But it ends for you." The standoff was brief but intense, ending with Langston in cuffs and the compound under FBI control. The aftermath was a blur of activity as the team worked to process the evidence and secure the site. For Ethan, the victory was bittersweet. They had dismantled the network, but the scars of the battle would remain. Standing outside the compound as dawn broke, Ethan turned to Emily, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "We did it," he said, his voice quiet. Emily nodded, her expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. "Yeah, we did. Thank you for sticking with us through this gripping story of betrayal, justice, and redemption." What did you think of Ethan's journey and the twists along the way? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to make sure you never miss another story like this one. See you next time.